January 1943. A pale Pacific dawn spreads over Guadalcanal, turning the treetops silver as mist drifts between shattered palms. The ground is still warm from the night's firefight. Spent cartridges lie half buried in the mud. The smell of wet earth, sweat, and cordite hangs motionless in the humid air. Along the jungle edge, a small group of exhausted Japanese infantrymen huddle in silence. Their uniforms are torn, their canteens nearly empty, none speak. They simply watch the tree line, waiting for the figures they know will emerge sooner or later. They had fought the British. They had fought Chinese divisions across half of Asia. They had marched through jungles, crossed mountains, and endured hunger without complaint. But this enemy, these American Marines, fought differently. There was no stopping them with night attacks, no breaking their line with sudden charges, no shaking their morale with bombardment or attrition. Every time the Japanese thought the Marines would pause, they advanced. Every time they expected hesitation, the Marines pushed harder, crawling, climbing, flanking, burning through every obstacle laid before them. For many Japanese soldiers, this relentlessness formed a single, growing realization, a fear that would echo across every island of the Pacific. And to understand why that fear took root, we must step back to the world these two forces were preparing to fight in. The Pacific War did not begin with balanced expectations. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy entered the conflict with confidence shaped by decades of battlefield success. Their infantry had defeated Russian forces in 1905, crushed Chinese positions throughout the 1930s, and expanded across Southeast Asia with speed that stunned the world. They believed their discipline, endurance, and willingness to die for the Emperor gave them an advantage no Western force could match. Yet across the ocean, a different kind of military culture had been quietly shaping itself for decades, the United States Marine Corps. By the 1930s, the Marines had already been forged through small wars in the Caribbean, campaigns in Central America, and bitter lessons learned in the trenches of World War I. More importantly, they spent the interwar years preparing for a type of warfare almost no one else studied: large-scale amphibious assaults against fortified shores. Their doctrine was written, tested, revised, and drilled long before Japan ever expanded into the Pacific. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the Marines were not simply another infantry force. They were a specialized strike arm, trained to land on hostile beaches, break through fixed defenses, and seize forward bases one brutal step at a time. Their training emphasized aggression, initiative, and small unit independence. Every platoon leader, every squad, every fire team was expected to keep moving forward even when cut off or under crushing fire. The Japanese, however, entered the Pacific with different expectations. They planned to fight a decisive naval battle, not a Long Island hopping war. Their infantry doctrine emphasized shock attacks, infiltration, and spiritual resolve. They believed night assaults and close-range charges could break Western units. They believed numerical surprise and fixed defensive positions could stall any invasion. But in 1942, on the island of Guadalcanal, these assumptions began to unravel. When the Marines landed in August, they arrived with limited supplies and barely any naval support after the U.S. fleet temporarily withdrew. Yet they held the airfield, they dug in, they counterattacked, and they did so again and again for months against some of Japan's most determined infantry regiments. Japanese soldiers quickly learned an unexpected truth: Marines did not break. Even when hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered, Marine positions refused to collapse under night assaults. Their fields of fire were disciplined. Their machine gun teams rotated without panic. Their riflemen held steady in the dark, firing measured, accurate volleys that stunned attackers who expected chaos and confusion. Japanese reports began describing unyielding enemy resistance and infantry that counterattacks without regard to losses. Captured diaries revealed surprise at the Marines' marksmanship, their use of combined arms, and their refusal to withdraw even when surrounded. Word spread through Japanese units moving toward the Solomons, and later toward the Central Pacific, that the Marines were different from other Allied troops encountered elsewhere. As the war expanded, the Marines faced the harshest terrain in the Pacific: coral atolls like Tarawa, volcanic mountains like Iwo Jima, and deadly limestone ridges on Peleliu. Each battle reinforced their reputation for relentless forward pressure. Even when casualties were staggering, the assaults continued methodically, backed by naval gunfire, tanks, flamethrowers, and well-coordinated infantry teams. It was in this widening conflict, where two very different military cultures collided, that Japanese soldiers began developing a deep respect and in many cases, a growing fear of the United States Marine Corps. That fear was rooted not in myth or legend, but in the very real qualities the Marines brought into battle, qualities best understood from several interconnected angles. Fear often begins with the individual, the small, human moments, when one soldier observes another and realizes the fight ahead will be unlike anything he has known. Japanese infantrymen entering the Solomon Islands wrote of facing opponents who showed no hesitation. In the jungle, men who advanced even while wounded, who held lines with a determination that felt unnatural after days of hunger and sleeplessness. Marine training placed immense pressure on stamina and close-quarters fighting, shaping riflemen who were steady under fire and instinctive in movement. Their culture emphasized personal responsibility, the idea that every man must carry the advance forward regardless of circumstance. Japanese soldiers were accustomed to enemies who recoiled under night attacks. Instead, they found Marines firing calmly into darkness, shifting positions without panic, and counterattacking with sudden bursts of aggression. These early encounters created a human impression, one soldier observing another's will, that formed the first thread of respect and fear. Tactically, the Marines operated with a cohesion the Japanese did not expect from Western forces. Their squad structures were built around fire and maneuver, with automatic rifles, grenadiers, and riflemen working in a fluid rhythm that allowed them to break through jungle defenses. Japanese infantry doctrine favored infiltration, shock charges, and night assaults, but Marines answered these with overlapping fields of fire, precise machine, gun placement, and a willingness to close the distance deliberately instead of yielding ground. During attacks on ridges and bunkers, Marines advanced in bounding movements, one element suppressing while another advanced, something Japanese officers noted with unease because it was executed even under heavy casualties. Small unit leaders made decisions without waiting for senior officers, an independence that allowed the Marines to adapt quickly to ambushes or sudden terrain shifts. This adaptability, this refusal to become disorganized, turned what the Japanese expected to be moments of weakness into renewed pressure. Technologically, the contrast widened even further. Marines brought with them tools that fundamentally altered the nature of close combat on islands filled with bunkers, caves, and fortified ridgelines. Flamethrower teams methodically burned out positions that Japanese defenders once believed impenetrable. Demolition units used satchel charges to collapse tunnels and destroy machine gun nests. Mortar teams, well trained and fast-moving, delivered indirect fire with accuracy that caught advancing Japanese formations by surprise. And above all, the integration of naval gunfire and air support meant that marine assaults rarely came alone. Destroyers raked beaches with precise bombardment, aircraft strat supply routes, tanks advanced alongside infantry through jungle paths. To Japanese defenders, often isolated low on ammunition and dug into fixed positions, the combination felt overwhelming. It was not the weapons alone, but the disciplined way Marines used them, turning each advance into a coordinated strike that chipped away at morale as much as fortifications. Leadership played a pivotal role in shaping this relentless character. Marine officers and non-commissioned officers were taught to lead from the front, to absorb casualties and continue the mission without pause. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, lieutenants and sergeants stepped forward repeatedly after their seniors fell, ensuring that units remained intact under punishment that would have broken less cohesive forces. This continuity of command, this immediate filling of leadership gaps, prevented the chaos Japanese troops expected to see when they inflicted heavy losses. Marine leaders also adopted lessons rapidly. After the bloody landing at Tarawa, amphibious doctrine was refined. After the brutal fighting on Peleliu, new methods for clearing caves and interconnected bunkers were introduced. Japanese commanders noted in their post-battle analyses that the Americans learned quickly and adjusted their method of attack, traits that deepened their concern. The Marines' ability to change tactics after each island, instead of relying on tradition or spirit alone, made them a growing threat with every campaign. Yet the deepest angle of fear came from the shifting psychological ground within the Japanese ranks. For years, Japanese soldiers believed their endurance gave them a moral and spiritual superiority, but on islands like Guadalcanal and later Iwo Jima, they encountered Marine units that endured the same hunger, the same heat, the same sleepless nights, and kept fighting with equal or greater resolve. Reports circulated among surviving Japanese units of Marines who advanced over coral reefs under machine gun fire, who fought hand to hand through caves, who pressed attacks even when casualties were devastating. Some diaries describe Marines as ferocious and unyielding, not because of cruelty, but because of their persistence under conditions thought impossible for Western troops. This erosion of psychological advantage, the realization that their enemy was as tough, as disciplined, and as willing to die as they were, shook long-standing assumptions within Japanese ranks. And as these impressions spread from island to island, fear was no longer born of rumor but of accumulated experience. These intertwined human, tactical, technological, leadership, and psychological dimensions were building toward a single moment when both forces would collide in some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The turning point came on a stretch of sand and coral no larger than a small town, BTO Island, Tarawa Atoll, November 20, 1943. It was here that Japanese soldiers first witnessed the full weight of Marine determination compressed into a single, unforgettable assault. The defenders of BTO were elite naval troops under Rear Admiral Kiji Shibasaki, a commander who famously boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. His fortifications were layered with concrete bunkers, interlocking machine gun fields, anti-boat guns, and trenches reinforced for last-man resistance. Japanese doctrine considered BTO impregnable. At 05 the Odrid, the bombardment began. Battleships thundered against the reef, cruisers pounded the airfield, and columns of smoke rose over Shibasaki's strongpoints. Japanese troops, sheltered deep inside their bunkers, survived the barrage. When the guns lifted and the assault waves approached, they prepared to inflict devastating losses. Many Marines were forced to wade hundreds of yards through waist-deep water after landing craft stuck on the reef. Machine guns opened immediately, cutting down lines of men. Mortars fell in precise arcs. Bodies drifted in the surf as exhausted riflemen crawled forward, dragging themselves onto the beach under relentless fire. For any defender watching, this should have been the breaking point, a failed assault, a shattered landing force. Instead, something else unfolded. Groups of Marines, often reduced to handfuls of survivors, kept moving. Corporals reorganized men who had lost their officers. Sergeants rallied shattered platoons behind thin sections of sand. Automatic rifle teams laid down bursts that allowed wounded Marines to crawl behind burned-out landing craft for cover. Engineers pushed forward with explosives, blowing breach holes through log and steel barriers while under direct fire. Every inch gained was paid for in blood, yet the advance didn't stall. By midday the beachhead was still fragile, but it existed, a wedge of Marines clinging to the shoreline, refusing to go back into the sea. Japanese troops counterattacked repeatedly, believing a final push would throw the invaders off the island, but each time they surged forward, they met concentrated fire from Marines who had dug shallow firing pits behind corpses and debris. Flamethrower teams began clearing bunkers, turning strongpoints into firestorms that forced defenders to retreat deeper inland. Naval gunfire, called in by spotters who had managed to reach the beach, hammered counterattack routes. As night fell, Japanese commanders expected exhaustion to slow the American assault. Instead, the Marines pushed again. They fought yard by yard, bunker by bunker, often crawling through sand choked with smoke and splinters. The ferocity of the fighting shocked even seasoned officers. Tarawa became a place where Marines advanced not in sweeping maneuvers but in brutal, intimate combat, grenades thrown into firing slits, satchel charges pushed under pillboxes, rifles fired at targets only a few feet away. The defenders realized, often too late, that the Americans were not withdrawing, not faltering, not hesitating. Marine units that landed with 200 men were attacking with 40 by sunset, and still going forward. The shock of this unbroken pressure cut through the confidence Japanese troops once carried. BTO's garrison fought almost to the last man, as doctrine demanded, but by the third day the island was slipping from their control. When the surviving officers reported that Marines had penetrated the central defenses and seized the command posts, the psychological shift was complete. Tarawa did more than prove that Marines could take a fortified island. It forced Japanese soldiers across the Pacific to confront a new reality. The Americans would endure bombardment, casualties, and chaos, and still fight with coordinated, relentless precision. It was a turning point not only tactically but emotionally, marking the moment fear turned from rumor into certainty. And from this moment of shock came consequences that reshaped the rest of the Pacific War. The impact of Tarawa rippled far beyond the beaches of Bishio. For the Japanese High Command, the destruction of an entire elite garrison in just 76 hours carried a weight far heavier than statistics alone. Shibasaki's force had been handpicked, well fortified, and supplied with some of the strongest defensive positions Japan had ever constructed. Yet the Marines had come ashore under catastrophic conditions, taken staggering losses in the first minutes, and still overwhelmed the island in 3 days. Reports filtering back to Rabaul and Tokyo described not only the loss of BTO but the manner in which it had fallen, to an enemy who advanced through enfilading fire, who assaulted bunkers one by one, and who refused to break even when reduced to scattered pockets of survivors. It was here that Japanese officers began openly acknowledging, for the first time, that American Marines were a different kind of adversary. Surviving Japanese soldiers who reached other islands carried stories that spread quickly among garrisons preparing for future invasions. Their accounts spoke of Marines who did not hesitate under machine gun fire, who used flamethrowers with terrifying precision, and who pressed forward even when the ground ahead was littered with their own dead. Some diaries recovered later on Saipan and Peleliu described Tarawa as a proof of American resolve, a moment when the myth of Western softness collapsed. These accounts, though written quietly, had immense influence. Fear rarely moved through official channels. It moved through whispered conversations, shared memories, and the grim understanding that no fortification was beyond capture. The United States Marine Corps also emerged changed. The cost of Tarawa was devastating, over 1,000 Marines killed and more than 2,000 wounded in the span of a few days. Yet from this cost came reforms that shaped every island that followed. Amphibious doctrine was revised, new landing vehicles were prioritized, medical evacuation procedures improved, fire support coordination became far tighter. What struck Japanese analysts was not simply that the Marines won, but that they immediately learned from their losses and returned stronger each time. By the time Saipan, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima came, Marine assaults moved with a precision that reflected the brutal schooling of earlier battles. Strategically, the fall of Tarawa shattered the confidence Japan once held in its outer ring of island defenses. The Central Pacific, once believed secure behind coral reefs and fortified positions, now felt vulnerable. Japanese planners began shifting focus toward deeper, more layered defenses on the Marianas and the Philippines, but they did so knowing the Marines were steadily mastering the art of island assault. Fear does not always take the form of panic. Sometimes it appears as quiet recalculation, a recognition that the enemy is stronger than expected and growing more capable each month. By 1944, intercepted Japanese communications repeatedly referred to American landing forces, especially Marine divisions, as units that must be defeated at the waterline or not at all. They understood that once Marines gained a foothold, the outcome became grimly predictable, bunker by bunker, trench by trench, position by position. Their defenses would fall under relentless attacks supported by armor, artillery, and naval aviation. The fear was not rooted in brutality but in predictability, the certainty that Marines would keep advancing until the island was taken, regardless of casualties or terrain. For Japanese infantrymen stationed on islands still awaiting invasion, Tarawa became a warning. For those still fighting across the Central Pacific, it became a lived reality. And for the Marines themselves, it became the foundation of a reputation that would follow them into every battle that remained. This aftermath set the stage for a deeper understanding, not just of who prevailed, but of what these clashes meant for the soldiers who fought them and the world that watched. In the end, the fear Japanese soldiers felt toward U.S. Marines did not come from legends, propaganda, or exaggeration. It came from witnessing, again and again, a force that fought with a steadiness that defied the expectations of the Pacific War. The Marines were not invulnerable. They were not superhuman. They bled heavily on every beach, carried their wounded through every jungle, and buried their dead on every island they captured. Yet what set them apart, in the eyes of those who faced them, was their refusal to allow suffering to dictate the outcome of battle. They endured it, absorbed it, and kept moving forward. Behind that relentlessness lay decades of preparation and a culture that treated responsibility as something shared, not imposed. A private on the line carried the same sense of duty as the officer leading him. When men fell, others stepped forward immediately. When a plan faltered, junior leaders adapted without waiting for orders. To the Japanese, who often operated under rigid hierarchies and deeply entrenched expectations of spiritual dominance, this adaptability felt foreign. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they saw initiative. They had expected fear. Instead, they saw determination that only hardened under pressure. The islands themselves became silent witnesses to this change in perception. On the ridges of Guadalcanal, along the shattered seawalls of Tarawa, across the limestone cliffs of Peleliu, and up the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, Japanese troops encountered Marines who fought with the same intensity on the final day of a battle as on the first. Every shock attack that failed, every position that fell after days of resistance, every bunker taken at close range added another layer to Japan's evolving understanding of its opponent. Fear did not replace respect, the two grew together. For the Marines, these battles shaped something far deeper than a wartime reputation. They became part of a legacy defined not by triumph but by sacrifice. The cost of each victory weighed heavily on survivors, shaping post-war remembrance and redefining what the Corps considered its own identity. The relentlessness that overwhelmed Japanese defenses was built on the lives of young men who advanced under impossible fire, who fought through exhaustion, and who held the line in the darkest hours of the war. Their endurance became the story remembered by those they fought and those they fought for. In the broader sweep of history, the Pacific War revealed a truth that extends beyond military strategy or national pride. It showed that courage can emerge from unexpected places, that assumptions about the enemy can crumble under the strain of reality, and that the human capacity to endure often surpasses what doctrine predicts. The fear Japanese soldiers felt toward U.S. Marines was not born from cruelty but from recognition, the recognition that their opponent possessed an unbroken will. And as the war moved island by island toward its final conclusion, that recognition became one of the defining forces shaping the brutal, unforgiving struggle for the Pacific.